Folded piece of paper tucked inside a jacket pocket. That's all it was? I wouldn't have even noticed it if I hadn't been the one dropping his dry cleaning off. 34 years of marriage, and I still do his dry cleaning. Old habits. The kind that settle into your bones so deep you stop questioning them. The note had a phone number. And beneath the number, in handwriting that was not my husband's, 3 words. Thank you, always. No name. No explanation. I stood there in our laundry room for a long time, holding that piece of paper under the fluorescent light. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window above the washing machine, a 62-year-old woman in a cardigan she'd owned for 6 years, holding a note that felt like a match struck in a dark room. I told myself it could be anything. A coworker thanking him for a reference, someone from his men's group at church. I told myself 12 different reasonable things in the space of 90 seconds, but I kept the note. My husband's name is Walter. Walter Eugene Hutchins, which he has always hated because it sounds, as he puts it, like a man who owns too many cardigans. He's been an architect for 37 years. Semi-retired now, technically, but still consulting on a few projects downtown. He's the kind of man people describe as steady. That was actually one of the words his best friend used in his toast at our wedding. Walter is the steadiest man I know. I believed that for a long time. We have 2 daughters. Our oldest, Claire, lives in Portland with her husband and our 2 grandchildren. Our youngest, Nora, is finishing her residency in Chicago. She calls on Sundays. Sometimes. For the last year or so, Walter had been, I don't know exactly how to describe it. Not distant. Not cold. Just slightly elsewhere. Like he was in the room but also solving a problem in his head. I chalked it up to the consulting work. The adjustment of semi-retirement. I've read enough magazine articles to know that when men slow down professionally, they go through a kind of quiet mourning. I gave him space. I made dinner. I did not push. Looking back now, I wonder if that was a mistake. The note stayed on my nightstand for a week, face down. I'd flip it over sometimes before bed, look at those 3 words, then flip it back. Thank you always. It's such a soft, affectionate thing to write. Not thanks, thank you, and always. That word implies continuity. History. I did not call the number. I'm not sure why exactly. Pride, maybe, or the particular terror of knowing. Because there is a version of your life that exists right up until the moment you have evidence, and I wasn't sure I was ready to leave that version. But then came the Thursday night. Walter told me he was going to his colleague Howard's retirement dinner. Howard Baxter, 30 years at the firm. Good man, well liked. The dinner was at a restaurant in the warehouse district. A private room, catered, the whole thing. I said, that sounds nice. I asked if spouses were invited. He hesitated, just a half second, just long enough. He said it was mostly a work thing. People from the firm, a few longtime clients. He said Howard had specifically kept it small. He smiled when he said it, which I noticed because Walter smiles easily, genuinely, all the time. But this smile was the kind that arrived slightly too quickly. I said, of course, have a good time. I said to give Howard my congratulations. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Here is something I should tell you about myself. I taught high school English for 29 years. I retired at 58, 2 years ago. In my classroom, I could tell within 48 hours of meeting a student whether they'd read the assignment or whether they were performing having read the assignment. I can hear the difference between someone who's thought something through and someone who's rehearsed it. Walter's answer about the dinner had been rehearsed. I called Claire that evening. I didn't tell her about the note. I just said vaguely that I'd been feeling a little disconnected from her father lately, that I was probably reading too much into things. She said, "Mom, you've never read too much into anything in your life." She said that like it was a compliment. I got off the phone and made a decision. If I showed up at that restaurant and everything was perfectly ordinary, I would never tell Walter. I would accept that I had become the kind of woman who follows her husband to a retirement dinner, and I would live with that quietly, and I would also probably make an appointment with a therapist. But if something was wrong, I needed to see it myself. I needed to know. The restaurant was called Lindell's. It's in a converted warehouse a few blocks from the river. The kind of place with Edison bulbs and exposed brick and a menu that changes seasonally. Not somewhere Walter and I had been together, which I noted. I'd looked it up online. Their website mentioned they occasionally hired event service staff through a local hospitality temp agency. I called the agency the morning after Walter mentioned a dinner. I explained that I had years of catering experience from church fundraisers and community events, which is technically true, and I asked if they had anything coming up that weekend. They did. They needed 2 additional servers for a private party Friday evening at Lindell's. The coordinator, a young woman who sounded barely older than my granddaughter, said the dress code was black slacks, white button-down, and sensible shoes. She said to arrive by 5:30 for setup. I said perfect. I drove to Target that afternoon and bought a white Oxford shirt in a size up for mine, something boxy and unremarkable. I found my black dress pants from the back of the closet. I pulled my gray hair into a low bun and practiced looking like someone whose name tag might say Barbara. Then I put on the pair of reading glasses I use only for crosswords, the wide plastic frames that Walter always says make me look like a librarian who's given up on people. I looked in the mirror. I looked like a perfectly forgettable woman who would refill your water glass without being asked. That would do. I arrived at 5:30 as instructed. The event coordinator at Lindell's, a young man named, well, he had it on his lanyard, Tyler, walked me and the other temp server, a quiet college-age kid, through the layout. Private room in the back, party of 22, seated dinner, 3 courses, open bar. He showed us the floor plan, where the service station was, which tables we'd each cover. My table was positioned along the far wall. Good sight lines across the whole room. Tyler asked if I had any questions. I said just one. What time were guests arriving? He said 6 o'clock. I had 25 minutes. I spent those 25 minutes arranging water glasses that were already perfectly arranged, folding napkins that had already been folded, and trying to remember how to breathe like a normal person. The first guests started filtering in at 6. Couples mostly. Laughter, the sound of heels on hardwood, someone already telling a long story. I moved between the tables and kept my head at the angle of someone focused on a task. I'd learned, all those years in a classroom, that the way to disappear in a room full of people is not to hide. It's to look purposeful. People don't notice someone who looks like they're supposed to be there. Walter arrived at 6:14. I know the exact time because I was looking at my watch when the door opened. He came in with 2 men I didn't recognize, laughing at something one of them had just said. He was wearing the navy blazer I'd given him for Christmas 2 years ago, and a tie I didn't recognize, a dark burgundy one, well knotted. He'd gotten a haircut recently. I noticed that too. He'd mentioned needing one last week. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. He looked nice. He looked like a man who'd made an effort. I turned toward the service station and stood with my back to him until my face returned to something neutral. Then I got to work. I served bread. I poured water. I smiled at people who thanked me, and I said, of course and certainly, And let me grab that for you in the bright, efficient tone of someone who does this every Friday. Walter sat at the center table, near the guest of honor, Howard Baxter, a big, loud, generous-looking man who was clearly loving every minute of his retirement party. I watched Walter from across the room. He seemed genuinely relaxed. He was laughing, listening, leaning in when someone spoke, the way he does when he's actually engaged. This was reassuring and somehow made me more anxious. And then, at around 7, a woman came in through the side door. She was younger than me by at least 25 years, 35, maybe 40 at the outside. She had dark hair cut short, and she was wearing a blazer the color of a winter sky. She wasn't part of the initial group of guests. She'd come in late, slipping in quietly the way someone does when they're expected but not announced. She stood at the edge of the room and scanned it. Her eyes found Walter, and Walter's eyes found her. He excused himself from his conversation, set down his glass, and walked toward her. They spoke close together, quietly. She handed him something small, I couldn't see what, from across the room, and he took it and put it in his breast pocket. He kept his back to most of the room while they talked. His body language was unmistakably private. I gripped the neck of a wine bottle until my hand ached. Who was she? I watched them for another few minutes. They weren't touching. They weren't romantic, exactly, in any way I could point to. But there was something between them. Ease, familiarity, the compressed body language of two people who've had many conversations. I needed to get closer. The man at the table nearest to where they were standing raised his glass slightly in my direction. I crossed the room, bottle in hand, heart going at a pace that my cardiologist would not have approved of. I poured the wine. I asked if he'd like to try the Merlot or stay with what he had. 3 feet to my left, my husband said quietly to the woman in the winter blue blazer. She has no idea. I've been so careful. The man at the table said something about the Merlot, but I cannot tell you what. She has no idea. I've been so careful. I set the bottle down on the service tray. I smiled. I said I'll be right back with that to no one in particular, and I walked through the kitchen door and into the back hallway, and I stood against the cool brick wall and I breathed. 34 years. I thought I knew every sentence that man would say before he said it. She has no idea. My phone vibrated in my apron pocket. I looked at it because I needed something to do with my hands. It was a text from Nora. Mom, are you home? I need to ask you something quick about Thanksgiving flights. I stood there in that hallway, leaning against an old brick wall that smelled like restaurant grease and old wood, and I typed back, "At an event, honey. Call you later." And then I stood there and made myself think. He'd said she has no idea. Not she'll be so surprised. Not she doesn't know yet. The phrasing was careful in the way of someone managing a secret, not planning a gift. I thought about the note. Thank you, always. I thought about the burgundy tie I'd never seen before. I thought about 34 years, and I thought, I'm going back in there. I'm going to finish this shift, and I am going to watch, and I am going to know what I'm dealing with before I walk out that door. I went back in. I cleared plates. I offered the dessert menu. I poured decaf from a heavy silver pot, and I moved through that room like a woman who had nowhere else to be. The woman in the blue blazer stayed for about 40 minutes total. She and Walter had 2 more brief conversations, always slightly apart from the group. She left before dessert, and just before she left, she reached into her bag and handed him what I now could see was an envelope. Standard letter size, sealed, He thanked her in a voice too low for me to hear. She said something, touched his arm briefly, just his forearm, the way you'd touch a friend. And then she left. Walter stood alone for a moment, the envelope in his hand. He looked at it. Then he slid it into the inside pocket of his blazer, buttoned the front, and walked back to the table. I made it through the rest of the dinner on some kind of autopilot I didn't know I had. Tyler shook my hand at the end and said I'd done great work and asked if I'd be interested in being added to the regular availability list. I said I'd think about it. I drove home along the river road instead of the highway because I needed the extra 15 minutes. I needed to decide what to do next. Confront him tonight? Pretend nothing happened? Call Claire? I walked into our house and went upstairs. I sat in the chair by the window in our bedroom, the reading chair, the one by the lamp. And I waited. He came home 45 minutes later. I heard the front door, the sound of his keys in the bowl by the entrance, his footsteps on the stairs. He was surprised to find me awake. He said he thought I'd be asleep. He said it was a nice evening. Howard's family was there. Good speeches. I said that sounded lovely. He sat on the edge of the bed to take off his shoes. And I looked at him, at the back of his head, at the way he held his shoulders, at the burgundy tie loosened at his collar. And I said quietly, "Who was the woman in the blue blazer?" He went still. Just for a second. Then he turned around to look at me. And here is the thing I was not expecting. He didn't look guilty. He looked caught, which is different. Guilty is when someone knows they've done wrong. Caught is when someone has been holding something carefully and it's just slipped out of their hands. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "How did you?" And I said, "I was there, Walter." He put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while, and then he started to laugh. Just a little, the kind of laugh that's mostly exhaustion. And he shook his head and he said, "Of course you were. Her name is Patricia. Wait, no. Her name is Suzanne. Suzanne Mercer. She's 38, a travel consultant who specializes in customized anniversary trips. She and Walter had been in contact for 3 months. The envelope he'd been so careful about, inside it were 2 round-trip tickets to Italy. Florence and the Cinque Terre, 12 days, fully arranged. Hotel reservations, private tours, a cooking class in a farmhouse outside Greve in Chianti, restaurant reservations, including one at a place in Florence that apparently has a 3-month wait. Also in the envelope, a handwritten itinerary with a note at the top that said, "For the woman who has given you 34 years and asked for almost nothing in return." Walter had written that, for Suzanne to put on the itinerary. He'd apparently workshopped it with her because he couldn't figure out how to say it right on his own. The bracelet, the one on the receipt I'd found weeks ago, the one I hadn't even mentioned to him yet, was also for the trip. A small gold cuff with an inscription on the inside. Still my favorite story. It was our phrase. From the card I gave him on our 10th anniversary, the year everything with his mother had been so hard, and I'd written him a letter. He'd kept that letter. I didn't know that until he told me, standing in our bedroom at 11:30 at night, still in his good blazer, trying to explain. The reason he hadn't told me about the dinner, hadn't invited me as his spouse, was that Suzanne was going to present him with the final package. There. The tickets, the itinerary, the bracelet, and he'd been keeping the whole thing in a folder at his office for 3 months, and he was terrified I'd stumble across it, which, he pointed out, I had nearly done anyway. She has no idea. He'd been saying it to Suzanne. He'd meant it as relief, that I hadn't figured it out yet, that the surprise was still intact. 3 months of careful, anxious, loving deception. I sat with that for a long moment. "You couldn't have just taken me on a trip without all this," I said. He looked at me very seriously and said, "You've never let me do anything big for you. In 34 years. You always say it's too much, it's not necessary, save the money. I wanted to do it in a way where it was already done before you could talk me out of it." I opened my mouth and closed it again. Because he wasn't wrong. I am not going to pretend it was all immediately fine. I was unsettled for days. Not angry exactly, but unsettled in the way that happens when you've braced yourself for something terrible and it turns out to be something tender instead. The body doesn't know how to release that kind of tension quickly. I'd been clenching something for weeks and it was slow to let go. I told Claire eventually. She laughed so hard she cried. She said, "Mom, only you would go undercover at your husband's retirement party work event." She kept saying undercover like I was in a movie. Nora was characteristically more measured. She said she was glad it turned out okay, and then she said gently that maybe Dad had a point about me, deflecting big gestures. She said it nicely. She says most things nicely, even the ones that land like a flat stone. She wasn't wrong either. We leave for Florence in 3 weeks. I've been reading about it. The way the light falls on the Arno at dusk. The way the hills look from the city in the early morning. The smell of old stone and good bread, and the kind of coffee that rewires your relationship to all other coffee. I've been reading about Cinque Terre, the 5 villages strung along the cliffside, the hiking path between them, the lemon trees. I've lived a whole life of not letting people do big things for me. A whole life of saying it's fine, it's really fine, we don't need to make a fuss. I learned it from my own mother, who learned it from hers, who learned it in the kind of circumstances where making a fuss was a luxury nobody had. Walter knows this about me. He's known it for 34 years, and he decided, at 64, to do something about it anyway. That note I found in his jacket pocket, the one that started all of this, I finally showed it to him. He looked at it and smiled. He said Suzanne had sent it after their second meeting, when he'd apparently been a nervous wreck about whether I would guess what he was planning. She'd written it to reassure him. "Thank you always." As in, thank you for trusting me with this. Thank you for caring this much about someone. I held that piece of paper and felt the particular foolishness of a woman who spent 3 weeks treating a thank you note like evidence of a crime. But also a small piece of me doesn't regret it. Not because I don't trust my husband. I do. I always have underneath everything. But because standing in that restaurant in borrowed black slacks and the wrong-sized shirt, watching a man I'd been married to for 3 decades laugh and live and make careful plans, it reminded me who he was. It reminded me why I'd said yes all those years ago in the first place. Steady. His friend called him Steady at our wedding. He still is. The bracelet fits perfectly. Of course it does. He's known my wrist for 34 years. The inscription on the inside is cool against my skin when I wear it, a small constant reminder. Still my favorite story. I used to think that phrase was about us, our story, the story of how we met, how we married, how we built everything. But standing in Florence last night, watching the sun drop behind the Palazzo Vecchio and turn the whole sky the color of a ripe apricot, I thought maybe he means something else by it. Maybe he means that we're still in it, that after all the regular years and the hard years and the years that just pass quietly without asking permission, we're still in the middle of it. We still don't know how it ends. I held his hand on the bridge and said nothing for a long time. He didn't need me to. I've thought a lot about what I actually did that night, not the logistics of it, the black slacks, the borrowed apron, the fluorescent light in the back hallway where I stood trying to breathe, but the choice underneath all of it, The choice to go find out, instead of sitting at home and letting the not knowing eat me from the inside out. People might say that was distrust. Maybe it was. But I think there's a version of distrust that comes from fear and closes things down, and a version that comes from paying attention, from 34 years of learning one person's rhythms so well that when something shifts, even slightly, you feel it before you can name it. What I felt wasn't paranoia. It was the intelligence of long intimacy, and I've stopped apologizing for acting on it. Here's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you when you're young. It's rarely dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It works quietly in the accumulation of small choices, the way I'd spent decades deflecting big gestures, the way Walter had spent decades watching me do it and deciding finally to work around me rather than through me. Neither of us was wrong exactly. We'd both just been operating on old instructions. Mine said, don't make a fuss. His said, respect her enough not to push. And somewhere in the space between those two instructions, 34 years of love had occasionally struggled to be seen. What Walter did, all those months of careful planning, the consultations with Suzanne, the burgundy tie he'd bought for the occasion, that was not just a trip to Italy. That was a man deciding that the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with deserved to be chosen again, loudly, in a way she couldn't talk him out of. That's a kind of moral courage that doesn't get discussed enough. It's easier to love people the way they've always let you. It takes something more to love them the way they actually need. And I had to reckon with my part in it. The note I'd kept on my nightstand, flipping it over in the dark. The weeks of sitting with suspicion I'd never voiced. There's no wisdom in that kind of silence. I thought I was being measured, patient, mature, but what I was actually doing was denying both of us the chance to just talk. That's the thing about accumulated quiet. It starts to look like peace, and it isn't. Nora said it gently, the way she says most hard things. Maybe I had a habit of pushing big gestures away. She was right, and I knew exactly where I'd learned it. From a woman who'd raised me to be grateful for the ordinary and suspicious of the extravagant, because in her life, extravagance usually came with a cost. I inherited that posture without inheriting the circumstances that made it necessary. What I took from all of this, from the folded note and the wine bottle I gripped too hard and the envelope that turned out to hold 12 days in Italy, is that the people who love us are often working harder on our behalf than we know, and that the smartest thing we can do, the bravest thing, is to let them, not to stand in the doorway of every good thing and negotiate it down to something more manageable, to say yes, to say thank you, to hold someone's hand on a bridge in Florence and let the silence be the right kind. Walter is still the steadiest man I know. He always has been. I just had to sneak into a retirement dinner in borrowed clothes to remember it.